This is killer. Oh, no, 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 no. And we are live. Welcome, everybody, to a nice Tuesday evening. And I have a very special guest with me, comic artist John Nadeau. And have I pronounced that last name correctly, sir?
That's exactly right.
All right, good. This is going to be a special hour and a half for me. For those of you that read the description, I read a lot of Dark Horse Star Wars in the 90s. And so to finally get to talk to the guy who penciled and wrote some of my favorite comics in the series, which were the Rogue Squadron books, which were all about the X-Wing pilots and their adventures, which captivated me both in PC gaming, captivated me in novels and the comics. It was my favorite thing from the original trilogy. But for those of you who don't know, you might have seen my video yesterday talking about Iconicon, which is our July 7th through the 11th convention. And John has kindly decided to join us to give us his expertise on 80s vehicles. So John is going to be one of our guest panelist experts on iconic vehicles of the 1980s. So John, thank you for coming on the show tonight. Thank you for taking the time.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Now, before we go into how you got started and where you started to pick up, drawing amazing machines and getting really good at both technical drawing and comic art, I wanted to ask you about your latest project, because you are now currently working on a book called Vector, and I'm going to bring up the images here. So this is one of the covers for Vector. Tell us a little bit. So that's number one?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about this book and what it's about and where people can get it.
It's basically the culmination of basically a lot of skills that I'd been developing over like the last 10 or 15 years, and learning to draw environments a little bit more in detail, from architectural rendering and taking the stuff that I'd learned in comic books, and wanting basically to deliver what's the biggest, vastest, most impressive location I could put in a comic book, and tie a story to that would be compelling. So basically, I wanted to, I guess, demo the skill sets that I'd been developing for the last 15 or 20 years, and that's basically the culmination of it.
So what's if you could give everybody like an idea of sort of the beginning premise statement of the story within Vector, not to give too much away, obviously, but what is the sort of launch point for the narrative?
Basically, it takes place on a human deep space colony, like more than 100 light years away from Earth, where human beings have kind of cut ties to Earth. It's the new world in a sense, but they're still getting immigrants from Earth. And one of the things that are valued on this colony is art objects from Earth. They get smuggled onto the colony, and the story basically involves gray market smugglers who deal in stuff like that, people who value these old objects, and the immigrants who are forced to bring them onto the colony.
Wow. So this is so when you say this is the future, how far into the future are we talking with this one?
Probably 300 or 400 years into the future, long enough that they've gone more than 100 light years out and have been developing the tech and the locations there for a couple of 100 years on top of that.
Right.
Maybe even 500 or 600 years. It's a lot of history to consider, and a lot of general relativity to try and keep going in your head. And when was this person born versus when were they? When did they start traveling to these new colonies? And it gets into really big tech and really big environments, things like that.
You seem to have, I shouldn't say seem, you have a great interest in both architectural and mechanical drawing and drafting, as well as being able to capture human and humanoid characters in comic form. I'm curious as to what drove you there. And I want to get to that question in a minute. I want to take the Wayback Machine to the beginning of your interest in both science fiction narrative and where that all started. Before I do that, though, one of the things we say around here at Retroblasting a lot, and our supporters know this, is that the fans are doing the best work, and you are clearly a fan of science fiction and genre settings. Is this book being published by a comic house, or are you independently publishing this book?
I'm publishing it independently so far. Whether that remains in the future kind of depends. COVID has kind of interrupted the marketing push. I was going to be at cons all last summer and last year, but things just kind of went askew with that. So and my career itself has kind of taken somewhat of a pivot, so I haven't been able to really focus too much on it. What the future plans were for publishing it, but right now I'm mostly concentrating on getting it finished. And then kind of leaving those decisions until I see what I've got.
Right. So right now you're working on. When you say getting finished, do you mean it's like a mini series, or are you still working on issue number 1 and 2 or something like that?
No, issues 1 and 2 are done. I'm working on issue 3 out of a total of 4.
Okay.
And when 4 are finished, they'll be collected into one graphic novel that will collect the whole story.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask you, because
good story.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's it's not too very long. I mean, it's taken quite considerations, having to kind of stop start. I think a lot of people who kind of do this, who have like regular jobs and do graphic novels on the side, probably already know the deal.
Yeah, well, that's why I brought it up, was because there's another independent comic that's gaining notoriety right now that was on a similar path, and that's why I wanted to ask you, because a lot of people are starting to, how do I put this? You guys are creating your own projects outside of the system, and there's one called Dusk Rider, which is also a 4-issue cycle that's now been collected into a graphic novel. And so when I saw the artwork and I saw the way you were putting Vector together, that's why I wanted to ask, because you are literally one of the fans doing the best work right now, which dovetails very nicely into sort of the pop culture world that we're finding ourselves in post-COVID. Well, I guess we're kind of still in COVID, but hopefully we're on the downswing of it. All right, so I want to talk to you about how you went from, let's work backwards. So we're looking at the culmination of, as you said, 15 to 20 years of studying and mastering your art style and merging both architectural, mechanical with traditional comic book artwork. Now, where did this all begin for you? Like, what were your interests when you were a kid? Like, going back, how do you feel like you fell into this, or where did your interest in this come from?
Well, like a lot of people my age, at least, that I hung out with school, I was, consuming the 80s pop culture stuff, Star Wars, Blade Runner, Aliens. I was going to the movies all the time, and I was fortunate enough to, hit just that sweet spot where you had 15,000 videos and you had Blockbuster. And if you, one of the things I did is if there was a movie that came up that I loved, I would seek out that director or the people that were working on that movie, Ridley Scott and James Cameron, and I'd look who are helping him to make stuff, and that kind of led me to this artist Sid Mead, who I don't know if you know him. He's this terrific conceptual designer from Blade Runner and Tron and Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and I sought out his books, and his stuff was kind of revelatory because he perfectly visualized futuristic worlds in a way that was very real. It wasn't like fantastical. I mean, it kind of was, but it was also realistic. I mean, his paintings for Blade Runner were stunning in how kind of lived in they were. And also, and of course, at that time, I was reading lots of comic books. And one of the key comic books that I read that kind of had an impact on me was the series The Nom by Michael Golden and Doug Murray. Doug Murray was the writer, and Michael Golden was the artist. And I can't tell you how stunned I was watching this and its precursor in serialized form was in like a Marvel fanzine, and it was just this stunning artwork that was non-superhero, and it treated technical reality very, very well, like the guns and the costumes and the tanks and all the surroundings of Vietnam. And it was a Marvel comic, but it was almost it almost didn't belong there. It was almost too good for Marvel Comics.
Right.
And seeing that stuff, as well as Akira, the Epic was reprinting Akira in color. And I didn't even know it wasn't originally in color, but basically those three things were kind of the informing influences on me at that time. Just how tech and future design could be rendered really, really kind of realistically, as opposed to a lot of stuff that had been in comics before that. I mean, I'd been attracted even to John Byrne's artwork, but even it wasn't as realistic as the stuff Michael Golden was drawing. And the Byrne stuff made me a fan, but the Michael Golden stuff made me want to do that.
Now, when you were growing up, then you obviously you were interested in the artwork, but were you also a kid? Like I was very fascinated by not only the ships in films and television and vehicles and things like that, but what I drew, but I would draw what I saw. In other words, I never really delved into drawing my own things, but I guess the question I'm getting at is, were you also a kid that built model kits? Because it seems like you would have been.
I built model kits, and another thing that I did was I bought books about aircraft. I started my little junior high library pretty young, and I would get these books about World War II aircraft or modern fighting jets and things like that, and they had all the cutaways, and they also had, and I would read them too, and read about the design evolutions of them, like why is an F4U Corsair shaped the way it was, and the reason for that is very fascinating from a technical standpoint, and it led to what looks like a really, really unique plane, and
right.
People who look at it think, oh, it's got the inverted gull wings, that's so pretty and whatever, but there's actual technical engineering reasons for that. And I read about them. I was fascinated by it. And it basically at that time in junior high and high school, I situated not on being an artist. It was kind of impressed on me that being an artist probably wasn't a good way to wasn't a good career to get into, and that aerospace engineering, which is how planes got designed, was probably a little better. And I tried. I mean, I went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University out of high school, and I was just terrible at it. Because apparently math is a big thing, and I was all right at math, and you can't be an engineer if you're just all right at math. I mean, I think I got in almost more on my appreciation and love of the engineering, like the story of how an F4U gets designed, and I think that made up for my lack of math skills, and that was just I pursued it a little longer than I should have in the early 90s, but ultimately I hit a wall, and basically it was there was no being an engineer, and so I started taking some of the offers that I was getting in the early 90s at the time.
Oh, it's for your artwork is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had already kind of self-taught yourself in many ways through your just general interest as a child and into your teenage years how to draw, and you just kept honing your skill. Were you, this is a foregone conclusion, but I'm just going to throw this rhetorical question out there because I'm assuming that you were interested in or enjoyed the mechanical fictional aspects of Star Trek and Star Wars as part of, okay. We talk a lot on our live streams and in a lot of the videos that we do and behind the scenes about the great debate between what's a cooler starship, the Starship Enterprise from the movies or the Star Destroyer. And we all land in different areas. It kind of tells us, you know, what our preferences are. But I'd love to know from your perspective and your learning, what do you like more that you feel is more credible, the Star Wars vehicle technical stuff or the Star Trek vehicle technical stuff?
I think I like the Star Wars technical stuff, and between the Starship Enterprise and the Star Destroyer, I'd pick the Star Destroyer because just from a design point of view, it's a little more iconic to me, maybe not iconic because there are a few ships more iconic than the Starship Enterprise, but I guess from a design point of view, it's more simple, it's more direct, and in its design, it more efficiently communicates the ethos of the Empire. Whereas I look at the Starship Enterprise, which is a brilliant design, but at the same time, I can kind of see some inefficiencies in it. It's like, okay, we're going to engineering. Let's get in an elevator that takes us on a big long angle and go up there. And if we're in engine number 1, oh, we need to get to engine number 2. Let's take another elevator down and then another elevator back up. Which is not to take away from how beautiful the ship is.
Right. But when you put it in those terms,
practically.
Yeah, when you put it in those terms, I concede to your objectivity. I absolutely do. I'm the guy that sits back and I'm like, you know, I'm a huge Star Wars lover, but I always hold out that the refit Enterprise is still the greatest vehicle that's ever been on screen, you know, and you know, my friends are kind of like, okay, Michael's doing his thing again. You go through your childhood and your adolescence and your teenage years, you're watching science fiction, you're studying World War II aircraft. Sounds a little similar to me, except I never even touched going into engineering, because if your math skills were just all right, mine were terrible. I chose the one major in college that didn't force you to take math as an elective. That's how bad I was at it. And then you started to get offers right out of while you were deciding to maybe pursue a different career.
Kinda. Basically, what happened was I was in between failing out of different engineering schools. I was taking some comic work to make money, which was, in a way, it's kind of in reverse. I was applying for jobs and getting them, but with the idea that this is going to make me some money to pay for my engineering school that I was flunking out of, which is, just looking back on it, is insane.
Right. Now, Jeff Barker is asking a question. He says he would love to hear your thoughts on the 70s space illustration work of Chris Foss.
I like his stuff. It makes me wish that the early Dune that they'd been working on, Jodorowsky's Dune, had been done, because there was a lot of his stuff in there. I think I remember I had gotten The Art of Alien, like in junior high or something like that. I would go to the comic shops and also buy the art books if I could find them. And Chris Foss was all over that book. So yeah, he had a kind of down to earth style of, if I'm thinking of the right artist, he had these kind of boxy designs for things, and I would just pore over those all the time. Yeah, I love the design. I love seeing his designs in movies.
And one more question before we move on to my next question, because it dovetails. Did Jack Kirby influence you in any way when you were growing up?
A little. When I was like in the early '80s, when I was a kid who didn't um, I didn't think I would end up in comics, but I did own How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way.
Hmm.
And Jack Kirby was all over that. And there was the thing about Kirby was he came out, or his stuff was still out when I was a kid, and the artist that got me into comic art at the time was John Byrne.
Hmm.
And in a way, there was Jack Kirby's was a more it was a much different art that didn't appeal to me as a kid, but I loved Byrne. But later, I those two kind of switched for me. I started to more appreciate Jack Kirby in the more primordial way he does it, and less detail oriented.
Uh-huh.
But I did kind of take in the chapters of How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way that had a lot of Jack Kirby stuff. There's really it's almost like you can't even like Byrne without liking Kirby, because Byrne himself was probably influenced a lot by Kirby.
Oh, sure. Now this is nice that you brought up Marvel, because I wanted to ask, to lead into this section, about the comics landscape in the early to mid 90s when you were deciding to take a new career path. At that time, I remember in 91, 92, I had come off Marvel collecting. I'd collected G.I. Joe, Amazing Spider-Man, a number of those books. I was very aware of the Nom, which you mentioned a while back, or in the interview. Now, when we were living in the UK, it was harder to get comics. But when you did, there were these tabloid-sized things at the newsagent. They had a different ratio. You could go into London to get American-sized comics at specialty shops, but we would just grab them at the newsagent because the content was the same. And that was when I first saw the Dark Horse Comics logo for Star Wars Dark Empire. I saw, and I collected all 6 of these digest size comics with Dark Horse Comics. And I started to become aware that there was this brand called Dark Horse Comics. And they were doing Star Wars, they were doing The Shadow, they were doing Aliens. They were starting to pick up a number of very interesting Predator, number of interesting licenses in the 90s. Was Dark Horse Comics your first leap, or did you work for another label first? Walk us through where you started once you started saying, you know what, I think I'm going to take some comic jobs.
Well, what had I would have to back up a few years before that, because
Okay.
at high school I just wasn't suddenly being offered comic jobs.
Right.
I was going to the little one-room comic conventions here in Orlando, where I live. Like you'd go to Ramada on a weekend, and there'd be the one little ballroom that would have a little tiny comic convention. And the people I kept seeing, one of them was Bill Black, who was the publisher of AC Comics, and I didn't know it, but that was published here in Longwood, here in Central Florida. And I'd run into him, and then I was just kind of stunned that there was comic publishing going on in my town.
Right.
And also, I've discovered that another artist living in town who I'd see at these conventions was John Beatty, who was the inker, one of the inkers on the Nom, and one of Michael Golden's best inkers. So I thought that was great. I'd talk to him, and when I'd go to these with friends, like me and my high school friends, we were all wanting to be comic book artists.
Right.
So we'd ask for tips and stuff, and show them our stuff, and our stuff was terrible, but we'd get better. But eventually, after hanging out, getting to know them after a while, and getting a little bit better, I managed to get assigned a short for a Durango kid story that AC Comics Americomics was publishing. Bill had the license to do all these old West comics from the 50s and 60s and stuff like that. And the Durango Kid was one of them. And I was thrilled. This was actual real work that would be published. And this was like 89 or 90. This is my senior year in high school.
Uh-huh.
And he got Dick Ayers of all people to ink it. And I didn't know who that was at the time, but I later came to learn that was one of Jack Kirby's inkers.
Wow.
Yeah. And on such awful pencils that I was provided. I can't tell you how awful my first job was. So if there's any hope that I can transmit to everybody, it's that a lot of us start off really with really bad art, and that was one of them. But I slowly got better, and Bill was kind enough to give me good feedback and let me do more little shorts. I mean, it wasn't great artwork, but it didn't. Thankfully, it didn't sink the company.
Right.
And it eventually got better and better. And I graduated in 1990. Started my terrible engineering degree attempt, and then while that was happening, I was sending samples to Dark Horse Comics because I was pretty sure I couldn't get in at Marvel and DC at the time, like 91, 92, something like that. But I heard back from Dan Thorsland, who was an editor at Dark Horse, and he put me together with a writer who was starting out, Dan Jolly, who's now doing novels and has done a ton of comic work. And I did an Aliens short for him, or that he wrote, called Cargo. And I was thrilled. I was on my way. So basically, it was those little things that Dan Thorsland would send my way in the very early 90s that got me kind of starting up the ladder.
You know, Dark Horse, I remember collecting it because I loved The Shadow, and I loved, of course, Rogue Squadron and a number of other books. Dark Horse really got my attention a lot in the 90s, and their artwork was, I know you can argue that, well, if you really read a lot of comics as a consumer, you can say there's a lot of difference between artwork and superhero books. But like, for example, sometimes I can't tell the artwork of Liefeld from Scott Campbell, you know, if I'm not, you know, looking, like some of their books and covers really can blend together because there are trends in the way these comics are done. Whereas with Dark Horse, it was like every book had a style, and every book style was very starkly different from the next, even within certain banners. So like your Star Wars Tales of the Jedi looked very different from your Rogue Squadron, which looked different from your Dark Empire. I remember how stylized Dark Empire was. So stylized, in fact, that it was kind of off-putting to me. I was like, well, you know, but that was my first. It was like a lot of blues and greens, and you know, it was very haunting in the way that it was created. Aliens being your first work with Dark Horse as a short, and I'm going to pull up one that I think this is just the cover, but you worked on this. Your name is on the cover. Was there any intimidation about going into the world of H.R. Giger? I mean, that had to, I mean, maybe with your mechanical background, you were totally cool with this, you know, but I would be intimidated as all get out. And my ignorance is speaking here, but I mean, that work that Giger does, that look that permeates Aliens, has got to be, I would think, daunting on some level.
A little, but at the time, if I'm remembering right, the mindset of me and my friends who are doing this was, oh my God, we're so awesome doing this. The comic book that I do for Aliens is going to just change the world. And it's going to be so awesome. I mean, we were really almost too stupid to be intimidated by this stuff. And I remember I took this stuff, especially Colonial Marines, I took that so seriously. And I remember I was kind of in Michael Golden mode, where if there was a control panel behind a guy in one panel, and then you saw that from across the room 3 panels later in a longer shot, that control panel had to be the same from earlier. I mean, that's kind of the level of seriousness that I took to this, which is not to say that that's how you should do it.
Are you saying there are more efficient ways to do this for certain panels versus others?
Oh, absolutely. I was Mr. Details because I thought, well, that's how Michael Golden did it, and that's how Katsuhiro Otomo did it in Akira. And really, I probably need to bring it down about 50% and be more fluid with stuff. If you look at that series and my work on that series, it's really pretty overwrought. I guess. I mean, I had a fun time doing it, and I put my heart and soul into it. But to do it over, I'd probably do it a lot differently. And it's a good little marker of where I was in my development, more than it's a marker of great comic book art, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. It absolutely does. What
And
was it? Sorry, go ahead.
well, another thing I'd say about Colonial Marines was that by the time I got to it, I did, if I'm remembering right, issues 8, 9, and 10. But by the time they were on issue 6 and 7 or something like that with another team, it had poor sales, and someone in editorial said, let's cut this off at 10. Let's take, because it was going to be a 12-issue series, and they decided they're going to cut their losses. And I remember something. Remember talking to Dan Jolly about this, because I think he and I were both equally enthusiastic to be working in James Cameron's sandbox to the extent that we were. And the directive came down, and we were looking forward to working on the concluding 5 issues of the 12-issue series. And I think, if I'm remembering right, I got a call from Dan, and he said, yeah, they want to cut it to 10, and their directive was like, just kill them all, which is how it happened.
Wow.
Which is a way to tie off a series. So that's my yeah.
You guys were the first people to do a Rogue One story. Then you just ended it at 10 and killed everybody.
Something like that. But I mean, that came down from on high. We would have taken it for 100 issues. I mean, we were just.
So tell me a little bit about the culture at Dark Horse when you started there. Like, you were there for quite a few years. What was the culture like working for the company that was taking on Marvel and DC? I mean, I know there was Image, which came around because of Spawn, and I know there was Malibu, but really, I mean, until Image cropped up, Dark Horse was really the dark horse in the room, hence its name. I mean, it was the third marquee. What was that culture like?
It's hard to say, because I did so much of my work remotely. I never went to Portland to visit there. I did everything through FedEx, and so Dark Horse to me was an editor on the end of a phone and a FedEx box.
How did they?
I really didn't get much of the cultural story of that place. I mean, I'd hear about stuff, and occasionally, like I went to Comic-Con in '97. That's the first time I met one of my editors. So it really was just working at home.
Wow. So you would get your marching orders, essentially, like all comic artists have talked about, and then you'd have to interpret that script and know how many panels per page and all that kind of stuff. It's fascinating to me, because as I've never been able to wrap my head around how you guys do that. And I'm sure one of the reasons is because you've never done it, Michael. I get that, but the other reason is just I have a hard time sometimes when I'm in a job and they don't give me any guide rails whatsoever, and it's just kind of like, yeah, you need to interpret this in a way that we're gonna like it, but we're not gonna tell you what to do. And I'm looking at your work, meaning as the penciler, any penciler, going, should this be a splash page? Should it not be? Maybe I need to save my splash page for this. Should be a big panel. That one should be triangular. How do you work that out? And
a lot of that's worked out for me. In the scripts will typically be broken down into the number of panels, because they've got to figure out, who's speaking when and where, and where the dialogue balloons are going to happen in a panel. They've got to, at least they'll almost always break down the number of panels,
Mm-hmm.
or they did. And if a splash page comes along, they'll say splash page, big
Oh,
shot
okay.
of this, you know, all the Marines together, or something like that. Sometimes the splash page will go at the very beginning to kind of
Oh,
set up the location that will break up into smaller panels in the later pages.
so what you're saying is they basically give you a kind of storyboard, and then you interpret those with your style and your pencils and everything like that, and bring it to life.
Well,
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Like they might say, two shot of these characters,
Mm-hmm.
or this is a wide shot of all 5 characters or whatever, and it's the full width of the page.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll be as specific as, saying, it's a full page width panel, or it's a vertical panel, or it's a small panel because the panel after it is going to be large. A
Right.
lot of times it depends on the amount of dialogue that's coming out of a character's mouth.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I had to learn at AC Comics was, if there's a dialogue scene and a character is talking, that I need to give the artwork space for them to put the dialogue balloons in, and that was something I forgot to do as like a high school senior. I would just put the face full panel, and it's taking up 85% of the page, and they're like, where the hell do we put the word?
Did they make you redraw that at that point? Did you have to go back and like shrink it, or did they just put it in between the panels?
Bill Black and Mark Heike probably they fixed my mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
and Mark Heike, who was the kind of workhorse at AC Comics, probably went in and did adjusted panel sizes and stuff like that.
Now we have a mutual friend here who wants to show some admiration. Matt Swafford, thank you for the super chat. He says, "Pretty sure I owe John at least 1 beer from Clicks in 2008." So here you go, old friend. Also, nobody draws aircraft like Nadeau, and that's a great place to move into my next question, which is, you're working on alien stories for Dark Horse. You're working remotely.
Mm-hmm.
How do they then assign you to another project, or do you have to campaign to get yourself on another project at Dark Horse? How do you?
Basically, what happened was, I tried to never screw up a deadline.
Mm-hmm.
Always be on time. Basically, be the perfect employee for them.
Mm-hmm.
Do my job well, and hopefully, when the time comes that the editors need to assign stuff to artists, they'll think highly of me. Well, this guy won't screw up my deadline. And I was, also, wanting to work on my art so that it's appealing, so that it gets fans wanting to buy the comic book. And what I learned later is that's the bigger draw, really, than being professional. And I didn't really campaign. I would, if I was on the phone with an editor talking about something in a script or something, I might ask him about, do you have upcoming stuff? I'd love to be working on stuff. But one of the things I didn't do, I guess, and which I found out that I probably should have, was, once I had a job with editors, I didn't seek out new jobs and new relationships with other editors, which I mean, for me, at the time, it would have struck me like stepping out on someone, but in retrospect, apparently I needed to have my bases covered a bit more.
Mm-hmm. So when did you get wind then? What's your story of getting wind of Rogue Squadron? How did that come to the surface?
I think by that time I'd done a couple of really small Star Wars things. I did a little Luke Skywalker mini comic that was in a Kellogg cereal box, like, giveaway.
Okay.
You sent in the or it was in the box itself. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
But I did that, and I did a Boba Fett story that was well received, and then Rogue Squadron came along, and I think having done well on Aliens, Colonial Marines, at least the book itself tanked and had to be cut 2 issues short. But I think they liked the experience of working with me on that. So I was, part of. I was in consideration to do stuff, but Rogue Squadron was in several. Went through maybe 15 or 16 issues before it came around to me. They had done them in little 4-issue arcs, and I think what they wanted to do was kind of go between different artists in different arcs, partially to keep it fresh, and also partially so that they could be ahead of their deadlines, because they could have multiple teams working on different arcs at the same time.
Well, before we jump into that a little bit, Jeff Barker would like to ask you, thank you for the super chat. He says, what pencils or pens do you like to use? Hot press or cold press illustration board, drafting pencil or rotring pens? What's your favorite gear?
Right now I use this. This is a pencil. It's a mechanical pencil that I found at like the drugstore about 10 years ago. And then I was able to my holding it has worn off the name for it, but I eventually found out the name and then got on Amazon and ordered like 50 of them. But if you can find this, it's just a 0.5 mechanical pencil. And I use these mechanical erasers. And back in the day, they would supply us with the illustration board. It would be, Dark Horse or Marvel brand. It would have their little logo in blue up at the top with the exact rate. They don't want artists using 10 types of different paper.
Right.
So I get the assignment to do, say, 4 issues, a 4-issue arc of Rogue Squadron. They'd send me a big stack of this illustration board. I still have a few of them somewhere, I think.
Now, was there a difference working on a Star Wars branded comic then versus working on a non-Star Wars comic? Because I know that Lucasfilm under George Lucas, even through the 90s, as we now call it, the dark years or whatever, the dark times, there was a lot of oversight and approval on certain products, and especially the expanded universe stuff, both in the novels and in the comics. Everything had to be, somewhat tied together in this kind of loose, unofficial canon. They were trying to keep things from stepping on one another. And also, from what I learned about Timothy Zahn writing the novels, is that they really wanted to make sure that all of their technology and their fantasy tech and all that kind of stuff was depicted properly. Were you given like a Bible to work with because you were going to be doing a book about all of their different tech? I mean, Rogue Squadron is Rebel fighters versus TIE fighters and Imperial class starships and all kinds of stuff. What was Lucasfilm's, if any, interaction with you, even directly or indirectly?
Well, I think a lot of the approval stuff had been worked out in the script stage, and since I never wrote a Star Wars comic, so by the time it got to me, which tech they were going to use was already decided on, and they knew I could draw an X-wing, I could draw a TIE fighter, and it would be up to their standards. So I never got a single note or anything about that. I think I never really had any like problems with Lucasfilm approvals or anything. At least not with the comics that I did, because it was probably all worked out in the script stage. The one thing I got that was pretty interesting was in like 98 or late 98 or something. I was this was after Rogue Squadron. I was working on the Star Wars ongoing comic, and they were going to do an arc about Ki-Adi-Mundi, the Jedi Knight that appears in
the prequels.
The prequels, episode 1. He's the guy with the really tall head.
Yep.
And I remember getting a FedEx box, and it had character photos of the actor in full costume that I should use as reference, because this would be before the movie came out, and no one knew what he looked like. Before that, if there was a new character, you made him up. But this
Right.
was what I was doing for the movie, so it was like these things, and they were marked confidential.
Uh-huh.
And that was like the first time that had ever happened to me
So,
as a comic book artist, which was kind of neat.
so you were one of the first people in the world to know what Ki-Adi-Mundi, Jedi Knight, would look like, the Jedi Master
Pretty much,
Mundi.
I guess.
Yeah.
Well, between that and the 5,000 people that worked on the prequels, yeah.
What did you? I know we'll talk. We'll get in depth about the expanded universe work prior to the prequels in a second. But did you have an initial reaction to that character's look? I mean, I know you did Aliens and everything else, so probably nothing shocked you by that point. But what did you think? Do you remember your initial impression?
I was pretty neutral on it. I mean, it wasn't. I think with a lot of stuff that was in the sequel, nothing about it really floored me or blew my mind about it. I think maybe Darth Maul with his twin lightsabers was maybe the only thing from at least the first movie that really super impressed me. But
Right.
Ki-Adi-Mundi, he was good. I mean, he looked like he belonged in the Star Wars universe pretty well, and it was novel to be getting stuff on the down low and told, don't share this with anybody. But other than that, I mean, it was just doing work.
Now, you get this project, and when I say project, you had a number of Rogue Squadron miniseries that you worked on. But we're gonna put it under the banner of Rogue Squadron. I know for a fact that you worked on Mandatory Retirement and Battleground Tatooine, amongst others. These are just some of the covers that I've pulled. But what I wanted to bring up first was this panel right here, because this really shows how you are able to not only do perspective artwork, but also keep everything in technical proportion. And this could be, and I think was, after a certain point in the special edition era, a shot that they would mimic, or maybe it was in the prequels with the Naboo fighters. These are like shots that they did later in the film with their modern CGI. What was it? I don't even know how to properly ask this question without sounding like a hopeless fanboy. How did you tackle these kinds of images and understanding like the dogfights? Was that from your World War II studies as well, like studying all those planes and watching the footage and just kind of knowing how to put things in physical space? Am I making sense?
I remember I had, even before getting the Star Wars comic book jobs, I was an avid collector of The Art of Star Wars, those books that came out in the 80s, and one of my goals was to make everything I drew as exact to how as I could to how it appeared. So on this, I'm sure I looked at every little photo I could get my hands on from those books about what the back of that X-wing looked like. Right. And drawing a lot of World War II fighters really gave me an idea of how to handle perspective, and also it's possible, I don't remember, but it's possible that the script itself might have said view from behind droid, looking at TIE fighters coming in and these X-wings going at it. I might not have made that up myself.
Well, but I mean, you had to pick the perspective, the angle. I mean, there's a million ways to get behind R2-D2 in this. The other thing that struck me about these images, John, is that when I was growing up in the 80s, early 80s, during the sort of last 2/3 of the Star Wars phenomenon, I would pick up the paperbacks and other different ephemera of Star Wars licensed stuff, whether it was a read-along book or it was a novel like a Han Solo or Lando Calrissian novel or something like that. And even as a kid, when I would look on the covers, if you look at the Lando Calrissian book covers, or less so the Han Solo, but especially the Lando Calrissian covers, and there are other examples, but these are the most stark to me. You have montage paintings on the front that show Billy D. Williams as Lando and then the Falcon doing something. But if you look closely, the pistol he's holding is the Kenner toy. but it's meant to. Somebody used that as the reference, and then the Millennium Falcon is actually the Kenner toy as well. It's
now,
not.
I'm surprised that made that by Luke. I'm surprised that made it past Lucasfilm.
Right. So when I was reading these comics in the 90s, your comics and other people's comics in the Rogue Squadron series, it was very refreshing to finally see artwork that looked like the movie filming models. And that's what I
wonder. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because I always wondered if you guys were using like actual photos they sent you of the models and things like that versus what I experienced in the 80s, where people were literally just looking at the Kenner toy and then painting that.
I wonder if the stuff from the early 80s, the Marvel, Star Wars, and the stuff you're talking about with the Kenner toy might have led to someone saying, we need an approval process for this, and if we're going to make comics, we need to run this art by Lucasfilm to make sure they're up to standards to avoid stuff like that.
Right.
I'll tell you something about just quickly about getting a reference. I remember working on Aliens. It might have been Cargo, or it might have been another one that involved either the Sulaco or maybe even Colonial Marines. Like, I remember really naively trying to get Boss Film on the phone. Boss Film had done had the model of the Sulaco for David Fincher's Alien 3, and I was going to call them and I was going to get them to photograph really super close details so I could use those as reference photos for Colonial Marines. And I don't think anybody ever got back to me. I think it was a hopeless attempt, but that was where my head was back in the early 90s.
Right. So what was the greatest? I know that, and I get it, because I've been in a number of jobs where eventually you're just glad to have the job and everything like that. But you're starting from a place of passion. Was there anything particularly enjoyable to you about the work that you did? I mean, because I know you took a lot of pride in Colonial Marines when you were talking about the detail you put into the interiors and things like that. What was it, if anything, that you enjoyed the most about working on Rogue One from an artistic perspective, if anything?
So many parts of it. It was such a fun series to work on. I mean, just paying the bills doing comic book art. I mean, when I was in junior high and high school, me and my friends would be like, man, it'd be so cool to be a comic book artist. And basically I was living the dream. So there was, I remember there were times I had a movie plan and I was drawing X-Wing fighters, and I remember I'd be doing pew, pew, pew. I'd be at, I mean, I'm not saying I'd regress to a little child, but there were times when I would stop and recognize just how lucky and how fun this was. I mean, this wasn't a real job. I was doing comic books. I was doing Star Wars comic books. That's like the greatest thing ever. and you kind of have to do that. I hear a lot of people be somewhat jaded, or having been somewhat jaded about certain stuff, but at least for me, the way I was raised on the pop culture of sci-fi and fantasy in the 80s, and especially Star Wars and stuff like that. I mean, a lot of this, I mean, even what you're showing right there is me wanting to be a filmmaker, and what's a creative angle to show an advanced TIE fighter. What's a cool angle to a lot of this is me feeding back the pop culture that came to me, and that's like the funnest thing, like an X-Wing flying through an explosion, stuff, the way aircraft go through clouds and the clouds wrap around the like that. I mean, I see that in movies. Time to feed it back to everyone else, and that's what just about all pop culture is. I mean, Star Wars is Lucas, feeding back the samurai movies he saw, and every director's got a story like this. This is just me, and possibly it's me leaning more towards movies and almost not thinking I'm a comic book artist, but a frustrated film director in a way. And that's partially that might explain a lot in that I'm trying to make it more realistic than your average comic, or I'm trying to make it more filmic. I drove people crazy sending little colored pencil sketches on photocopies of my pencils to instruct them how to best color my stuff, which I'm sure they properly tossed when they got them, which I would do if I were a colorist. But that was me wanting to take complete control over stuff and make these little movies. I mean, I like I say, I took it way too seriously.
Yeah, I'm looking at this artwork, and that was why I was wanting to ask you about, the whether or not artists would lean on a model kit or a toy for some of this stuff, even just to get perspective. Because I mean, and I'm not. It's just me going. I guess I'm not as in my mind's eye as clear as somebody like yourself who's put in the training and the work to understand. Like, I love Spitfires. I love P-51 Mustangs. I love B-17 Flying Fortresses. I grew up studying them as far as like being interested in them. However, I'm looking at that angle of that TIE Advance, that TIE Interceptor, and I'm going, I would need a model of it over my head, like this, and look at it, maybe even take a picture or something before I did that. And what you're doing is you're saying, I'm just using reference photos, and then you're understanding spatial relationships and giving that's what made this so kinetic. And there was a question earlier. Were you at the time, because of your interest in aviation and everything like that, and you're making these comics, were you also reading some of the novels that were being made for Rogue Squadron, or playing the video games on PC like X-Wing or anything like that as part of this?
No, I wasn't a gamer, and I was I think I'd read one of the Rogue Squadron novels, but it wasn't until a couple of years later.
Right.
I think I was more concentrating on the visuals comics.
Now we have let's see. We have some super chats here real quick that I'm going to blow through. Captain Binome, thank you for the super chat. It says something about G.I. Joe Renegades. I've never talked about G.I. Joe Renegades. I think you got me confused with somebody else. And understanding need to get used to the art style. I've never talked about G.I. Joe Renegades, so I'll look it up, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. Oh, thank you again for the super chat. Sorry about my other super chats being off topic. Just been wanting to get that off my chest for a while. Well, like I said, Captain Binome, I've never discussed G.I. Joe Renegades, so I'll look into it, but I think your axe is needing to be grinded with somebody else. All right. Now, you get done with Dark Horse, and meaning you get done with Rogue Squadron. You were on that for how many years?
It was a pretty short run. I think it was like 2 or 3 on and off, and like maybe over the course of 4 arcs, something like 4 issue arcs, and maybe another that I did some background in. There was some stuff where I was just kind of assisting in a few areas. And also, I point out that as good as I was back then on the technical stuff, one of the things that I was kind of under par in was faces. So there was even some ones that I worked on where they had someone else come in and do the faces, and I hate to admit that because it's a failing, but I guess embrace stuff like that where there's some art that's I'm credited as penciler, but someone else did the faces. And,
well, I don't know. These faces look pretty good on Vector.
Well, that's like this century's art. and believe me, when you have to face the ignominy of people doing faces for you, you double your efforts to master them.
Well, I didn't see any. I mean, I think I'd say this with having actually seen panels of your Western comic. I actually saw the black and white panels. Found those on the net, and I was trying to find more information about it, but I wasn't able to track that down before our interview. I maybe I'm an old soul, but I didn't have a problem with your faces. I thought they were just fine. So,
Well, thanks.
Raymond, thank you for the nice super chat. He says, Mr. Nadeau, I love your work on Rogue Squadron, especially in the Empire service and mandatory retirement. Was there any direct consultation with Michael Stackpole, who wrote the comics as well as the novels?
I don't think directly. The closest I got to that, and I never wrote anything for Star Wars. The closest my input like that was, and this would have, like, I remember I was at the bookstore and I was looking through this book of giant like construction equipment, and there was this thing, I think they only have it in Europe, which is a bucket arm. But basically, it's like a 500-foot arm at the end of which is a 75-foot in diameter thing with all these buckets over the edge. And I thought, well, that's an Imperial machine right there. And I talked to my editor and said, we have to put this machine in Star Wars, because it's just so big and ugly and destructive and powerful. And they're like, okay, we'll see if we can do that. And that had to make it to the writer to either say, okay, we can do that, or screw you for giving me or whatever, which they did not do. They were kind enough to put that in. But as far as direct consultation with Michael Stackpole, I think he was more macro on a lot of stuff, and I was more kind of tip of the spear, and a lot of that stuff would have been decided by the time it got to the script stage.
Now, I just thought of this while you were explaining all of that to Raymond, because you were talking about, the way that he would sort of be macro over the whole thing. Were you guys as artists, even though you were remote, were you looking at or seeing some of the other Dark Horse projects within your wheelhouse that were being published at the time? And did you guys have kind of like, you'd look at somebody else's artwork in another Star Wars book that had machines in it, for example, and go, like the World Eaters or something like that just looked like
from like Dark Zone.
Yeah,
I saw that stuff, but only at the comic shop stage. Mm-hmm. I don't remember if there was any, like, my editor going, oh, I'm going to send you some advanced copies of this or that. I don't think any of that happened. Although I might have got some, like, month before freebies sometimes from Dark Horse. But for the most part, no, we were pretty isolated at the end of the FedEx route.
Right. We have another question for you. Thank you for the super chat, Tree. He says, thank you, Michael, John, Scuba Pete, and Michael S. Those are our moderators, and they're really good people. John, who are your influences, or what was your most challenging project? Well, I know we've talked a little bit about your influences, but maybe there's some we haven't touched on. Or what was your most challenging project?
I would say for comics, the most challenging projects were the ones where, they'd leave me some creative freedom to design a vehicle. I designed a transport for aliens, colonial marines, and I was pretty proud of that. But because it had to, it was almost like a movie design where it had to meet the challenge of holding the tanks that they were going to take out on their mission, and also having areas of conversation, and the script would go around this thing, and the whole thing had to be designed, and there were certain things it had to do, and there were other, and I designed a transport similar to that in Star Wars, and that had needs that had to be met. So, and they were fun challenges. The hardest ones were, I guess, where I was getting late on deadlines, and I would have to do all-nighters to get them done, because my rule was never, ever, ever, ever be late on a deadline, because there are 1,000 people sending resumes, and
right.
I didn't want to screw anything up. And the hardest one was, I remember I was at the end of an all-nighter. It was noon the next day, and I still wasn't done, and it turned into another all-nighter in a row, and that was like in the middle 90s, and I look back at that and think, oh, never again.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you think back on your your college exams, your graduate school
Mhm.
exams, and you go, how did I get through that period of my life? Because I remember how
Yeah.
stressful it was. What was the comic book scene like? I mean, even though you were working remotely, you were part of that industry while it had boomed and while it was leveling off. And I don't mean tapering, it was still strong, but it was just finding a plateau by the late
Mhm.
90s. What was that like? You pulling all-nighters? Was there a lot of, I mean, obviously there was a lot of competition to outsell the next guy. What kind of pressure did you put yourself under or find yourself under at that time?
Um, the pressure was mostly self-generated.
Hmm.
I was usually ahead enough and trusted enough by my editors that they weren't calling me going, "Hey, you're gonna be able to make it on time,"
Hmm.
because I was. And as far as like career, like competition stuff, I never. I mean, my thinking was I'm just going to do the best job I can. I mean, there's nothing that I can choose to do that's going to make any effect on sales other than do the best job, and that's it. So I didn't really have a big awareness of overall comic industry chatter or trends or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't until really much later that I, uh, you know, oh, my job went away because of this, or they're asking me to do this because of this, or something like that. I
Right.
mean, um, yeah, it's how much you choose to read about the industry and whatever magazines that came out at the time, and I didn't really do that. I mean, I had some friends who were also working in comics at the time. We hung out, we talked. For a few years, we were in a studio together, but other than that, we were basically riding a wave that we were not in control of, and
Hmm.
nothing we weren't working at a high enough level that we were that it had enough that we had much of an effect on it anyway.
Right. Now, I'm going to go back to one thing real quick because I just had a random thought.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard the story of how Kenner Toys started the Star Wars toy line, but they were making $6 million man dolls that were this tall at the
Mm-hmm.
time that they got the license, and they realized that they couldn't make Luke Skywalker and Han Solo dolls because then they said, "quote the Millennium Falcon would have to be 5 feet in diameter, and nobody would buy that."
They did do like the very first ones were about 12 inches tall, though, weren't they?
Yes,
There was a lot of those.
yes, they had a 12-inch line that ran concurrently with the initial 3 3/4 inch figure offerings. But
Mhm.
the reason that they went like this, literally, the myth is that they went like this in the boardroom and somebody measured fingers. But I won't go into all that. But they said we can now sell the vehicles because they told each other, they were all in the brainstorming room, and they said this movie is about the tech. It's about,
Mhm.
for a toy line, it's about the vehicles and the creatures and the things that the characters have to interact with. So I guess to bring that around, going around my rear end to get to my elbow, is that I know you said it just a few minutes ago that you were kind of self-conscious about the fact that occasionally they would have another artist do the faces. But if
Mhm.
you consider the fact that what's important in a Star Wars story is the tech, is the, even with the toy line, they needed you because anybody could do the faces. That, I'm just saying, not everybody could do the tech, because I've read a lot of comic books, and I'm my audience will tell you I don't BS people. All right. In
Mhm.
fact, that's why I get into trouble all the time, is that I don't. And I've seen a lot of great comic artists that, when it comes to people, the guys are like, whatever. But then they
Mhm.
cut to a drawing of an airplane, and it's like, the airplane doesn't even look like it could fly. I mean, it looks squishier than a GB. I mean, it's just,
Mhm.
and it's supposed to be this fighter plane. So I guess what I'm saying is, you seem to follow in this tradition with your career, as far as Star Wars is concerned, of you're the person delivering the essence of that story with these fighter squadrons. We need the guy that can draw the fighters. The faces, well, we'll figure that out later. So yeah.
Well, Michael Golden made those Huey helicopters, so just perfect. So
Mhm.
I had to make my tech as cool as I could.
You did a
Every
bang up.
rivet, every rivet had to be there.
You did a
If I
bang up.
pull it off.
Yeah, you did it perfectly.
But I'll tell you one thing. There was a script that I got, and I think it was from In the Empire Service, and this character came down that was in the script, and he didn't have a description. And I called my editor. I was like, "What does this guy look like?" And I think he said, "Well, just make something up." And his name was Baron Soontir Fell, and he was a TIE fighter pilot that in the story is going to come over to the rebel side. He was almost like FN 187, you know. And so I made him look like me a little bit, and I probably shouldn't have done it, but there I did it. And after I stopped working for Star Wars comics in the 2000s, apparently with the prequels, they started the toy machine back up again, and so they not only ran out of, I guess, characters from the Star Wars movies to make action figures on, they started dipping into the comic books. And to my shock, they made a Baron Soontir Fell action figure, and damned if it doesn't look like me. In fact, they made two of them. They rarely make two action figures. He had a flight suit version, and he had a dress uniform version. So I get to say I'm the only kid on my block with a Star Wars action figure.
Well, it's
only the little one.
Right. When they were doing the hyper articulated versions with the better joints. It's funny you just told that story, because we just got this question from Wolfie. Thank you for the super chat. He says, John, your work is fantastic. Did you get any say in the Rogue Squadron action figure comic packs that Hasbro put out in the 2010? So clearly, in a certain way, you did, because your character got in there.
In a way, I didn't expect those to come out. I was gone by the time those came out. So those were kind of a pleasant surprise. I don't think I got any money from those. I don't think that's how, because that's not how corporations work. But,
right.
Oh well.
Were you able to track them down? Do you have them in your collection?
Yeah, I've got some of those.
Nice.
It's a good thing to show people, but I'm not. And a fun little trivia thing about me, but other than that,
hey, I'd be over the moon if I found out that happened. So, what was your next project after Rogue Squadron was done, and then the prequels, of course, were done? You did the Ki-Adi-Mundi story. Did you go on to do more prequel stories after that, or?
I did. Yeah, I did 2 or 3 issues of the Star Wars ongoing series. I might just be a 2-issue arc with Mace Windu, and he's on Ryloth or something like that, and that was fun to do. After that, I think comics were just kind of contracting a little bit, and with like 30 editors in the entire universe of jobs available to get to people, I think I was just out on my ass. It was just, I had been working in a paradigm where I'd do a job and then it was over, and I'd see if another job was happening, or wait around for another job, and then at some point after those, it was like, nope, there is not another job happening. And what happened, what I found out later was, and I mentioned this earlier, was my editor ended up on Rogue Squadron, ended up leaving Dark Horse for some reason, and so I suddenly was faced with trying to get some more work, and naively I thought that, well, my work on Rogue Squadron will benefit me from, will lead to another job, maybe even just from them knowing about it. Nope. So I mean, I was back to sending samples to editors from 5 years ago, and not having talked up other editors or spent time with other editors or gone drinking with other editors, me being in Florida and Dark Horse being in Portland, Oregon, I was suddenly out on my ass at the time that I was doing literally my best comic work of my entire career.
So Matt Swafford sends us a super chat. He says, I just want to point out how great John's detail work is in his new comic Vector. as well as how amazing his Disney fine artwork is. So when did the Disney artwork begin?
That was actually just a few years ago, back in 2018. I had done just as a thing to hang over the couch, a painting of the Millennium Falcon. And it was like 4 feet wide, and it was literally just something I did to occupy my time. And around that time, Disney bought Lucasfilm, and I knew Disney had a series of galleries, and I thought, and while it was over the couch, I was like, maybe I should sell this or whatever, or try and recoup the hundreds of hours I put into this painting. And well, if Disney owns Star Wars, maybe they'd want it. And I was doing commercial art rendering for a different division of Disney called Disney Events Group. And I asked my boss there if he could put me into contact with whoever was involved in running the Disney galleries. And he was very kind, and he got me an interview, and I brought that painting and a couple others, and I asked him, what is it? Would Disney be interested in Star Wars stuff? I'd been a comic book artist for Star Wars, and I went down to the Disney gallery and looked at what they had, and I thought, oh, I could maybe do something like this, but Star Wars would be even better. And he looked at it and he said, that's a fine painting, but it's 1 foot larger than we have in our galleries. But can you do a castle? Like, yeah, I can do a castle. I'll do a castle, sure. So that's how I got started. I did a Disney castle. I did the Disney castle. I imagined, what would that castle that you see in the opening video of the Disney videos, the one that starts at the spire and then comes down, and what would that look like if it were in a real universe, in the real world? And so I painted that up, and that led to more and more after that. That's how I started.
Did you enjoy that work as much as comic books? Which one? I mean, I know it's always good to have work, but I mean, did you enjoy fine art painting? Did you find that you enjoyed it more than comics, or less? Or I know, because you love the art of storytelling. So
yeah, it's different. I think comics will always be kind of closest to my heart, but at the same time, with paintings, you're in control of everything. And in the last few years, since 2015, I'd really been working on my painting game. And once you start doing that, the possibilities kind of open up. Like you work on a painting, and it's got a little fog in here, and you think, oh, maybe for my next one there'll be a whole bank of fog in the background, and light will be shining through it and stuff. And so one thing leads to another, and you get to do sophisticated imagery that you can't do in comics, or at least not without driving a colorist crazy. So basically, between that and the vector stuff, all of which are kind of like back when I was working in the 90s, are I'm taking way too much time on, but I'm happy with the results, because I really get to release my inner cinematographer and really just make stuff that really lets my imagination run wild. I mean, there's the fun thing about vector is part of its genesis was, what is the biggest thing that I can put? Like, if I were making a movie, what movie would I make that I could never get enough money to visualize? Like, I basically set it in a location that not even James Cameron could afford to visualize, I guess. And so basically the idea was no limits on everything, which is my take on doing comics. I mean, as long as I'm doing a comic where I'm only limited by the time I'm putting into it, why make it about two characters talking together in a white room? Right. Really let my imagination run free, and not only that, but develop my imagination. A lot of people say, let your imagination run wild. Well, that has a practical application. It means, like, it's the line from what's the dreamy Christopher Nolan movie, Inception.
Oh, Inception.
dream bigger. Well, once you're faced with doing stuff, you draw something and think, how will that look better, bigger, or what's a way to improve this? After a while, your palette starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's what kind of vector is all about. It's showing a location and then showing more of it and more of it and more of it until you're showing the most spectacular location that anybody could imagine, if that makes sense.
Yeah, using comics as a medium that other mediums can't follow into because of sheer budget and technological limitations. You know, comics used to show us people with red capes that could fly. Well, now in the 21st century, they finally can, still at great cost, but they finally can show us live action dudes in red capes that can fly. But they can't show us things of a certain scope and scale beyond a certain point. Now, where can people get Vector? Where can they go to purchase the 2 issues of Vector that you have out right now?
Currently, it's available. The first issue is available on Indie Planet, and you can order a hard copy, or you can get a PDF of it. Also, contacting me directly, and I can mail issues of it out.
I'll put the link in the description of this video for everybody. So after this interview is over, everybody, I'll put a link to Indie Planet in the description.
Right, and now that COVID's kind of winding down, I'm planning on taking it to the convention circuit. So hopefully we'll be able to see me in person. Get a signed copy.
That would be great. We have some comments here. So let's see. First, I wanted to show you Wolfie's comment here. He said, "Guess who's going to be my vintage TIE Interceptor pilot when I'm done restoring it? John Nadeau as Baron Fell." And Samuel Proctor asks, did you do any of the Knights of the Old Republic comics? I just started collecting them and I was curious.
No, I think those were going on parallel to me. But I didn't work on any of those. I did a little bit of background work on a couple other Star Wars comics, but at the moment, I'm not remembering exactly which ones.
And then Oliver would like to ask you, Mr. Nadeau, if you were given artistic freedom, what kind of weapons in Star Wars would you like to invent and give to the Empire and the Rebellion?
That's very interesting. I always loved how in the Star Wars universe, everything is at a gigantic scale. Nothing's ever small. All their machinery is huge. So probably something like that. Maybe something that walks around like a walker, but is maybe the size of a city. Something like with the bucket wheel excavator arms or something like that. Where the Empire gets the resources to make all of this, stuff.
Yeah, that's the big question. And then Jason Anderson would like to say, comics also allow the reader to dwell, to absorb the art at their own speed, which for the more detail-oriented artists and detail-focused fans is superior to film. I can agree with that. I mean, I think you can sell a moving city or a construct that's as big as a moving city a lot better in a comic than you can in, say, a live-action movie, which we saw happen with what was that called? Peter Jackson produced it. It was the ones where the cities are going around on treads. Right. Yeah. And then Michael Schaefer would like to ask you, Mr. Nadeau, being into vehicles, were or are you a car guy?
I'm a car visual guy, but I'm not terribly great at the actual tinkering around with them. I draw them all day long, and I love seeing them in movies and on TV. I love Mad Max in particular, and the way they modify those. And I love designing them. In fact, I'm right now I'm planning a series of oil paintings of race cars and sports cars for a gallery in Daytona later in the year. So part of my research for that is photographing local sports cars that I see on like Park Avenue in Winter Park where I live.
Wow!
And once you're on the lookout for sports cars like that, you start to see them everywhere.
Do you have a particular era of sports car design that you like more than others, like a decade or a time period or a philosophy of sports car design? Because I know that, in the 90s, they got away from the wedge, but in the 70s through the early 80s, it was all about the wedge shape. Do you have like a particular preference?
As far as race cars go, I do like the late 60s, like the Porsche 917s and the Ferraris, the ones, the very organic, the ones with the very organic flow over the wheel wells, and the cockpit was very much kind of like a spacecraft. It's really as close to a spacecraft as like Le Mans cars ever got. Beyond that, maybe the 30s racers, the 30s, Monaco Grand Prix racers, things like that.
Right.
I don't like terribly the 70s Le Mans stuff that were like slab sided, and then I think at some point in the 90s and 2000s, the Formula One cars really started to look like spaceships, which I think is pretty interesting. But
I didn't know if you were. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, now that I'm painting them, I'm starting to notice all sorts of things about race cars and really appreciating them.
I didn't know if you were like when you were talking just now about you weren't into cars of the late 60s through the 70s. I didn't know if that included things like the Monte Carlo rally cars, like the Lancia Stratos or anything like that, which I know is very wedge shaped, but it has that curved windshield. It kind of curves around, and so there's these styling cues where they kind of marry up two different philosophies, and it shouldn't work, and yet it does. It's very strange.
I like those. I like them almost as much as time portals into designs from another era, and also it kind of takes me back to like the F4 Corsair that I was talking about. I look at a car like that and wonder how much of it is design and how much of it is functionality, because at some point I know that functionality took over. They're taking stuff into wind tunnels, and they're not doing anything just for the looks of it.
Right.
So I look at the racers from the 60s and look at the all that kind of heavy body work and think someone made this car look gorgeous. So what were they fighting against aerodynamically to get this
right
or whatever in there?
Now, speaking of that era, Jesse'd like to know if you saw Ford versus Ferrari and if you liked that movie, if you saw it.
I love that movie. That movie was maybe my favorite movie of 2019. In fact, one of my paintings upcoming for the gallery G500 early next year, probably be during Speed Weeks, will be a Ford versus Ferrari painting.
And then Gigamox says, I just had the pleasure of reading through all of the Rogue Squadron again in the Epic collections. Thank you, Mr. Nadeau.
Thank you.
So I know that we're at the 90-minute mark here. I don't always end up touching on everything. So is there anything that I missed that maybe you'd like to bring up or talk about before we sign off?
I would say there's one period that after comics that kind of delivered me to where I am now, was a job that I ended up getting almost by chance. In like 2000, not only did I stop working for Dark Horse, is I completed my film degree, which is what I ended up going to college to get. But I was also kind of out in the wilderness career-wise. I didn't want to follow my friends to California to be a little fish in a big sea.
Right.
And what I ended up getting was a job at a local architectural rendering firm, and spent about 8 years doing hand-painted pictures of buildings. And my boss there was a guy who used to be an assistant to Sid Mead.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was just down the road. That that company had been down the road like as long as I'd for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that informed a lot of it. It basically showed me the quick way to draw stuff. What I ended up doing was a lot of pen and ink drawings of buildings for watercolorists.
Uh-huh.
That was like this big, and it was like, here's like a 2 foot by 3 foot drawing of a villa with palm trees. You've got a kind of quick inking technique and a facility with doing environments that kind of in a way directly led to vector.
Uh-huh.
Because before that, in my previous comic career, everything had dainty and delicate, and all the details were very minutely drawn and exacting. And this was a new style of artwork that I'd never even heard of. I didn't know there was such a thing as architectural rendering in its various forms. And basically, this taught me a kind of a new level of looseness towards precision, if that makes sense. It was like a loose way of doing and that in a way led to being able to have no limits for doing stuff in vector. I this other job, I guess. I would say.
Well, I cannot wait to sit down and read Vector. Matt's been telling me about it, so I'm going to be picking it up here real soon. But for everybody listening out there, I'm going to put the link to where you can go look at Vector and get either the hard copy or the PDF in the description of the video. I really want to thank John. Thank you so much for taking the time, this hour and a half, to do this with us. I know that this is right ahead of Iconicon, and you're going to be with us for the 80s vehicles panel. What's that? I'm sorry.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I can't wait to have your expertise on that, because that'll make the panel so much more fun, especially when we get into possible good-natured, heated debates with some of the panelists about what makes a good movie car or movie vehicle. I have a feeling you'll be able to smack a bunch of us down with some objective logic on that.
Okay.
But guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've had over 120 people throughout the entire interview, and more people will see this on the replay. But again, Iconocon's coming up July 7th through the 11th. John Nadeau will be one of our guests. He's listed on the website. You can go check out his details on iconicononline.com. And he is one of the drivers behind the visualization of my favorite aspect of Star Wars growing up, which was the X-Wing fighters and the Rebel Alliance fighter pilots. So, John, it's been a pleasure getting to know you tonight and talking with you.
You too.
And I'll see you. We'll see all of you guys at Iconicon. So, everybody, have a good night, and we'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.